So with that, thanks for coming to this webinar. It's called Very Specialist Bees and the Flowers That They Love. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Nancy Lee Adamson, who will be presenting today. Nancy is the East Region Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist for the Xerces Society and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in Greensboro, North Carolina. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Nancy.
Well, thank you, Molly, for hosting us today. And I also want to gratefully acknowledge the Sissipaha, Ino, Saponi, and Shakori Native peoples from whose ancestral homelands I'm sharing this program today in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'd also like to thank Denise Ellsworth and Olivia Carroll for whose Ohio Wild Bee course I developed the first version of this program. And when I was searching for photographs of specialist bees, I couldn't find many of them. And I realized it was a great opportunity for bee course participants who are helping to document Ohio bees, that it's a great way to kind of plan to go looking for bees is to think of the specialist bees and the plants that they might visit. And besides documenting what's in Ohio, they would also be helping to provide photos of bees that I couldn't find. And so I hope you'll be inspired to do so yourself. And I want to thank all of you Bee City USA and Bee Campus affiliates for all the joy and understanding you're sharing to help us all be better stewards of the natural communities we live in. For those of you not familiar with Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA, I wanted to highlight the mission to galvanize communities to sustain native pollinators by increasing the abundance of native plants, providing nest sites, and reducing the use of pesticides. Affiliates are among the most creative and delightful people on earth and are raising awareness and improving our lives. Oh, I haven't had much sleep the last few days, so anyway, thanks for all you do. You guys do amazing things. Today, I wish we had a bit more time, but since I may skim a lot of slides quickly, I want you to know that they're posted at a tiny URL, tinyurl.com/specialistbees. Well, actually, I have not yet posted them, but I will post them by the end of the day today, along with additional resources. Since I'm based in the East, the program is a little bit Eastern biased, but I've discovered some wonderful new tools for the whole country that I'll share. I hope this program will do three things. One, inspire you to learn more about the specialist bees and host plants in your region. Two, to plant or protect those species. And three, to start sharing your sightings via iNaturalist and other community science programs like Bumblebee Watch, BugGuide.net, or Quest for Bee Nests. Many native bees are pollen specialists. They collect pollen from only one species, genus, or family. They may collect nectar from many different plants. So an oligoleg or mesoleg bee collects pollen from one plant family or a few related genera or species. And a monoleg bee collects pollen from a single species or genus. These bees have evolved with their host plants. Specializing makes foraging more efficient. Specialists can digest their host pollen better than others and may be more effective pollinators. But if something happens to the plants or climate affects emergence times of the bees and plants differently, then both groups may suffer. One may have no food and the other may have no pollinator. One thing I didn't see listed on the specialist bee site was how specialists may more easily encounter their mate. Some bees find their mates at the nest and others on flowers. Some bees also collect oils and resins from host plants that help attract their mates. And they also use them for building their nests. When I put this program together in June of 2019, Fowler and Drug Drogi just had the eastern list. Since then, Fowler has greatly expanded that list, adding phenologies, showing months that each bee is active in the region. Plus, he's created a central and western list. Each list has slightly different collections of information and all include detailed reference information. From any one, you can easily find the other sites. If you scroll down these pages, you'll find recommendations regarding conservation. They found that 60% of pollen specialists are rare. Sam Drogi with the USGS periodically sends out reminders to a bee monitoring listserv to be on the lookout for certain bees and plants based on documented phenologies. So these are phenologies he developed for the eastern U.S., but as I mentioned, Jared Fowler has added month data to the specialist bee list, but this is still nice to go and explore if you're in, I think most of these species are in the mid-Atlantic, and so with 60% of specialist bees listed as rare, knowing when to look for them can help guide monitoring and conservation work, but it's difficult to have a uniform sampling method the way that we do for birds, for example. So any kind of documentation you provide will be helpful. Here's what the eastern page looks like. It has the bee family, then genus and species. When you click on any of these links, they take you to the Discover Life pages if it's a bee. If you click on the plant family or genus, it'll take you to the USDA plants database. And I circled the Andrena arabis to point out that oftentimes the host plant is in the scientific name of the bee. Not always, but oftentimes. And sometimes it's the wrong or a different plant that it's a host to, so that can be kind of confusing. Anyway, when you click on the bee, then it'll take you to Discover Life, and that's what a page would look like. And if you click on the plant, it'll take you to the USDA plants database. And I just want to quickly highlight that you can zoom in on the plants maps for county distribution, and that this same data is also available at BONAP, which is the Biota of North America Plants Atlas. And then sometimes people don't realize on the plants database, if you're in a genus like this one, we're looking at Helianthus, which is sunflowers. If you click on the subordinate taxa tab, you can see the maps of all the species that you would also see in the BONAP site. So for the eastern group, Fowler also created this host plants for pollen specialist bees of the eastern U.S. So you can glean this info from the bee list, but he includes plant species on this page. And he even includes a list of recommended plants if you scroll down to the bottom of the page. Note that he's including everything for which you could find documentation, but that doesn't mean other species in that genus are not host plants. This is where you come in. So documenting visits will help us understand more connections. On the host plant page, Fowler lists the species, not just genera. In the recommendations, he highlights species that aren't readily available and encourages propagation of these, many of which are annuals, biennials, or obligate wetland or upland species. I like to share this example. I know it's not a bee, but I want to illustrate how your documentation of wildlife encounters might help improve our understanding of habitat needs. We know a lot about caterpillar host plants. We think as long as the caterpillar has its host plant, it should be fine, right? The pipevine swallowtail butterfly's caterpillar feeds on Dutchman's pipe, but can you imagine this chrysalis blending in quite so well on the bark of any other tree? So this really made me wonder, how important is its pupation site to its survival? And this kind of data, if more people take photos of bees and chrysalises and caterpillars, anything out in the wild, when we are able to look at large data sets, then we can really start to understand other parts of the environment that might make a difference to the survival of a species. So for the central U.S., we have 2 other data sets, and Michael Arduzer, who sometimes works with the Missouri Department of Conservation, recently shared this Excel list through the bee monitoring listserv. And I did post a copy of that on the tinyURL site, and I suspect he'll be updating this over time. And then one of the first lists was developed by John Hilty, and that's still up. That's part of the Illinois Wildflower site. And then I also wanted to mention that my Xerces colleague, Sarah Foltz-Jordan, worked with Heather Holm to do a presentation on the native plants for insect specialists and nesting for Minnesota. I couldn't find that one online, but I did find this presentation by Heather that was last July, and I think it would have a lot of similar information. So I'm going to jump into finding specialist bees and the flowers they love. So what I did was I used the list from the specialist site to kind of look up all the different genera and see what species of bees and plants were in each family, related to each plant family. So I'm going to go through them alphabetically, and I'm going to go through kind of quickly since we have a limited amount of time. But again, all the slides will be posted, and then once this replay goes up, you can also click on it to pause. And so forgive me for going a little bit quickly through some of these. So in the parsley family, there are lots of other plants in the parsley family, but the only one that's listed on the Fowler-Droege site for the east was Zizia. So again, there's other things like sweet cicely and lots of other parsley family plants that may have specialists that we don't know about. And the more we can document visitation, then the better we'll be able to understand those connections. So I wanted to thank Jennifer Hopwood for sharing some photos from the central U.S. and another golden Alexanders. And it's very hard to identify some species just with a photograph, but this is an ungenid bee, so it might be the specialist Ziziae. And then the holly family, there's lots of different species of holly that are wonderful for lots and lots of different pollinators, but a lot of the specialist bees are in this genus Coletes, and I included 2 of those, Brimley and Banksy, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing any of these things correctly. But notice the pollen on the back of Coletes Banksy. It's the pollen that she doesn't brush off or put into the pollen ball that she puts in her baby's cell underground that gets carried to the next flower she visits, and that's the pollen that's effective for pollination. So the aster family has a huge number of specialists. So there's whole groups, most of the longhorn bees, and some of those are in the genus Melisodes. Some are in some other genera. And so you can see I included a list of the other bee genera in the east with sunflower specialists, Coletes, Dianthidium, Dionomia, Melisodes, Perdida, and Pseudopenergus. And I don't have photos of all of these, but a good number of them, just to give you a sense. And this one here that we saw a little bit earlier, Angina acepta, is a little bit unusual. Most of the ungenid bees that I'm familiar with are active in early spring, and this one is a specialist on sunflowers, and they don't come out till late fall. And again, here's another photo that Jennifer Hopwood shared from the central states, and it's a good reminder that there are a huge number of asters in the central and western states that we don't find here in the east, including these beautiful tansy asters. And if any of you read the little blog that I wrote for, kind of before this program, I mentioned the carpenter bee mimic leafcutter, and this is one bee that you can easily recognize out in the field on site. Because it's a leafcutter, at least the female, she'll carry pollen on her belly, which you can see in that mountain mint photo and a little bit in the Coreopsis photo. And she's all black, and there's really no other bee that looks like her, so you can recognize her on site in the field. And then here's some of our longhorn bees, Melisodes. I'm not sure if that's a Savastra. There's another group of bees, Euthera, that look a lot like that. And but many of the Melisodes are specialists on asters. And the male bees are called longhorn bees. Well, the group is called longhorn bees because the males have extra long antennae. And all male bees actually have longer antennae than females. They have one extra segment. They have 13 instead of 12. But in the longhorned bee group, those antennae are also extra elongated. And thistles are a really wonderful plant for lots and lots of different bees. And I don't know if either one of these is a specialist, but the next photo we have one from Jennifer that highlights a specialist on Cercium. But I just wanted to mention that, because we have some invasive species of thistles, some states have eradication programs or require eradication of certain species of thistle. And where I came from in Maryland, I remember someone mentioning that they thought all thistles were on the noxious weed list. But when I actually looked up the law in Maryland, that wasn't the case. It was just the one species of Canada thistle that was considered a noxious weed. And most of our native species are not aggressive at all. They don't spread the same way. And so unfortunately, some of our eradication efforts have actually decimated some of our native thistle populations, and they are very, very important for wildlife. And here's another one of our native bees on the right, the Paranthidium jugatorium, that you can recognize out in the field to sight. It's got a very unique coloration, almost wasp-like on its back, and then it has those leaf cutter hairs on its belly for collecting pollen, and it is a sunflower specialist. And so here's one of the photos from Jennifer of a Melisodes desponsa on thistle, and this is a really distinctive looking bee as well. And you can see the pollen on her legs is white. A lot of the pollen on thistles is very light colored. So the bellflower, this is one of my all-time favorite flowers, and if anyone has ever seen these flowers up close, they're just amazing. And so it would just be wonderful if someone could capture one of these coletes on the flower, because I couldn't find any. And these bloom, oh gosh, you have to look on Jared's list to see when the bee is active, and it's probably the same time when the flower is in bloom. So the morning glory family, and I know we have a lot of introduced morning glories that are considered weedy, but we have these wonderful native morning glories that have very interesting names. And if any of you have listened to Robin Wall Kimmerer, she mentions that when there are a lot of common names for plant, that's usually an indication that it has important cultural value. And in this case, one of our native morning glories is called wild sweet potato. It's also called manroot, man of the earth, wild potato vine, and wild rhubarb. So that indicates that it's probably a pretty darn useful plant. And it also happens to be the host for some of our native bees, including Melatoma toria, and that's the one I most commonly see in the flowers. And I usually see the one down at the bottom. You can see it's a male guarding his territory. He's looking out to make sure some other male doesn't hone in on his territory, and if one does, he would rush out to chase it away. And then the other one, the Cimolobus ipomea, I don't think I've ever seen one, and I would just love to. I should have put in one of the other photos from the USGS bee monitoring lab showing their face. They're just a really beautiful bee. And so we have several other species of native morning glory. And this is one that I never see propagated, and I would just love to be able to buy a plant of Ipomea pandareta. So the dogwood family is very important, and we oftentimes don't think of dogwoods as being that important for bees, but there are several specialists that depend on it. And so over there on the right, you can see that besides the Andrena fragilis, there's also Andrena integra, Andrena persimulata, and Andrena platyperia that are all uncommon species and depend on dogwoods. So the ones that are listed here, Cornus alternifolia, Cornus amomum, Cornus rugosa, and Cornus sericea, are all shrub-type dogwoods. So they would be very easy to include in almost any landscape. And our squash bees. And so when I generally talk about specialist bees, I usually start with the squash bees, because if anybody has ever grown squash, they have probably seen the little squash bee, and they are about the same size as honeybees and even very similar in coloration, but their behavior is very, very different, so it's very easy to recognize them. The males are territorial, and you can see the one in the center. He is looking out. He has a little light spot on his face. And then the females, you usually just see their rumps because they're busy collecting nectar at the base of the flowers. And sometimes the squash flowers close at midday, and the males don't have nests, so they sleep in the flowers. And if you gently squeeze the flower, you might startle a little male, and he'll come out. So the blueberries, we have a huge diversity of native blueberries and heath plants. So the vaccinium and Galosacia, which are huckleberries, support lots and lots of different bees. But we have one specialist in particular, that's the Southeastern blueberry bee. And it looks very similar to a bumblebee, but if you see them flying, they just have a little bit different behavior. And we have another bee that has very similar coloration. The males of the Southeastern blueberry bee have a little white patch on their face. So if it's early spring and you see some bees that look like bumblebees, but they're a little too small, and they're hanging out around blueberries or huckleberries, there's a very good chance it's a Southeastern blueberry bee. And when they fly, they also, I feel like they leave their legs dangling and their tongue hanging out. So you can start to recognize them. Once I take a picture of them, forget it. I can never recognize them. But there is a way to tell the difference if you can get a good picture of their legs, because bumblebees have corbicula, little pollen baskets like honeybees on their legs. And Our other solitary bees, they mainly have kind of hairs all over their legs to collect pollen, and you can kind of see that on the right with the female. Rather than being a big ball of pollen, it's kind of spread out throughout her leg. So here's one of our native vaccinium that it doesn't really produce fruit that we can eat, but it has beautiful, beautiful flowers that always remind me of, they just seem to be dancing. And this is one that you don't see very often in the nursery trade, and it has gorgeous foliage, and I would recommend trying to propagate that one. So the legumes have, it seems like a lot of the specialists for legumes are the leafcutter bees. And so these are the types I see most often in North Carolina, and I really need to collect some and identify them to species. But you can find lots of different legumes in our region and all across the country. And I just wanted to point out, this is a little bit of a digression, but of course legumes are very important for our diet, and sometimes people think of our beans as not requiring pollinators, our peas and beans, but if they do receive visits from pollinators, yields can be as much as 10 to 15% greater, and so just wanted to keep that in mind. Alrighty, so the geranium family, we have this beautiful native geranium here in the east, Geranium maculatum, and it has a very interesting sex life, and it's called gynodioecious, and that means that there's female flowers and then hermaphroditic plants that coexist in the same population. So that means that there are some part. So here's the female part of the flower, and then here are the male parts with flowers. So Andrena distans is one of the specialists, and I'm not sure if I've ever seen one. So that would be another one. It'd be great to get a photo. It's such a common species, and most people have these, if they love native plants, have some in their garden. And it's very possible this little Andrena is visiting your garden. And then the waterleaf family. These are just wonderful plants. We have some native species. Some of them are annuals, and here's the fringed phacelia, and this is I think it's a rare plant in North Carolina, but where it is found it's very abundant, and you'll see lots of bees, and this may well be its specialist. And notice that the name of the bee is Andrena phacelia, which is the common name of the plant in this family. They're called Phacelia tennessetifolia. Oops, I'm not sure if I have the right name for fringed phacelia there. Phacelia tennessetifolia is a species from Western California. So I will update that slide before I post it to the tiny URL. So the mint family has a few specialists, including this Duphoria monardi, and but I often see little tiny bees visiting the flowers and just collecting the pollen at the tip. And then over here on the right is our carpenter bee, and of course that's a more generalist bee. And the lily family, I got to see this beautiful display of trout lilies up in southwestern Virginia at Mount Rogers. And I noticed that the lilies on a rainy day have their petals kind of closed, and then on a sunny day, look at the difference. And all those little speckles, if we had UV eyeglasses would even be more pronounced and saying, hey, come and get me, here's the nectar. Those are our nectar guides. And they are hoping somebody will come and land and collect their pollen while they're heading for that nectar. So the rose mallow family has a specialist bee. Again, it's another one that looks a lot like a bumblebee, but it doesn't have the corbicula on its hind legs. And again, when you see a bee that looks like a bumblebee that's in a rose mallow or a cotton flower or an okra flower, Kosteletskaya is our seashore mallow on the eastern part of the U.S. And you'll also find these on introduced species like the Rose of Sharon. It's a good bet that it is the rose mallow bee, and they are active for a relatively short period of time, and there usually be a lot of activity during that time. And it's really fun to find their nests in the ground, and if you've never seen them, you should do a little search in YouTube to have a chance to look at those, or use one of the links here. And I do have a little tiny clip that we'll see if I can get it to work. Yeah, so I'm going to just do it a couple times. But this is how they actually collect water in pretty dry ground in order to make these little balls to excavate their nests. So the evening primrose family has a specialist, and I just love this photo. And so there's other specialists on primrose that are in the leafcutter family, the longhorn bees, and also Sebastian, which is another type of longhorn bee. And but this one, of course, takes the name for the primrose family, Lasioglossum enothere, or I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce that correctly, but. And then the passion flower bee, and I should have included the little clip from Kim Bailey. She got a nice little video of the passion flower bees mating on. And if you have these little Passiflora lutea at your house, these bees will find it. And so you can definitely capture photos. It's hard to capture just because they're very quick. And then this passion vine on the right, carpenter bees aren't considered specialists of passion flower, but in Mexico, where they raise the passion fruit for juice and other products, they actually provide nesting blocks for carpenter bees because they are such efficient pollinators of the commercial type. And we have a native passion flower that is similar to this one that is shown here. This is our native maypops, and you can see how perfectly the carpenter bees fit on those flowers. And my friend Kim makes jelly with the passion flower fruit, and it's the most wonderfully fragrant jelly on a toasted croissant you could ever have. So highly recommend it. And then these are also the host plants for wonderful fritillary butterflies, and so you also get incredibly gorgeous caterpillars and butterflies that are attracted to the plants if you grow them. And this is another one that's really easy to encounter. If you have a spring beauty, chances are you'll find the native Andrina originae on the spring beauty. And the pollen on the spring beauties is actually pink. So it's really, really cool. And you can see her pink pollen there. So this is a little bit of a digression, and it's just really neat because you can really see when you're looking at spring beauties how the flowers are actually indicating to the bees when they're ready to be visited. So here you can see the pollen is ripe. It's a darker pink when it's ready, and that's a signal to the bees to come and get it. So the Jacob's ladder or phlox family, I couldn't find any photos. So this is one that we really need some help with documenting the Andrena polemoniae. And again, there's that the name of the plant in the bee's scientific name to tell you how important that plant is to that bee. So the Pontederiaceae, this I got to see Pontederia cordata flower up close, and they're really, really beautiful. So if anyone can get a bee, one of these Duphoria on the Pontederia, that would be wonderful. So the Florilegus condignus and Melissodes apicatus are also specialists in that family, and and then again, my list that I'm showing you today is mainly from the eastern list. So in the central states and the western states, you probably have even more. And then the buckthorn family. So some folks who are up in the northeast know that we have an invasive species of buckthorn, but our New Jersey teas are not invasive, and they're absolutely wonderful for pollinators. And so here is one of the specialist bees, Pseudopernergus pauper, that you might find if you grow those plants. And the rose family, of course, is one of our most important families for our some of our fruit. That includes apples and strawberries, of course. And so here's one, the Andrena ziziiformis, and it makes me wonder if it looks similar to the specialist on golden Alexanders, which is called zizia. But in any case, some of the other ones are Andrena and Panerginus, and Potentilla is one of the genera in the rose family. So here's another one, the Andrena crataegii. So crab apples or hawthorn are really important trees in the early spring. There's not a lot in flower, and so there's a good chance you can catch one of these Andrena crataegii if you grow some hawthorn in your yard or visit one of the beautiful mountains around Mount Rogers. Let's see, and the madder is in flower already around here. We have the little bluets have been blooming probably for maybe a month and a half already. On a warm day, I've seen them. And so be on the lookout for Pseudopernergus virginicus. Now, in this photo, neither one of those are Pseudopernergus, and it looks like I left some stars in there by accident, so I'll take those out too. Okay, and I assume this is a specialist, one of the specialists, but there's a bunch of ungeniid bees that visit willows. And so this is one plant I highly encourage you to plant some native willows. And in this area where I am, it's very hard to find any shrub type willows, but those would be the nicest to plant if you wanted to see bees visiting, because they'd be at eye level. And if you're into basket making, then you could maybe harvest some of those shrub willows for baskets as well. Alrighty, the saxifrage family, another one of my favorite plant families, and just be on the lookout if you're lucky enough to see the heuchera or tiarella in flower. The saxifrage wasn't listed on the Fowler and Jogi site, but I'm guessing that some of those visitors may be specialists as well. And the nightshade family, of course, is very important. That's the family that includes potatoes and tomatoes and eggplant. And it also includes the ground cherries. And if you've never eaten a ground cherry, I really highly recommend it. They're really delicious, and they have a specialist, Coletes, that one of my professors, Ty Rolston, studied. And he actually did capture and release, and now instead of using little marks, he actually puts a tiny little QR code to track where the bees return to. And Scrophulary ace, the figwort family, you might be able to see one of these beautiful native mason bees, Osmia distincta. And Verbanaceae, I only found this one, Caliopsis nebraskensis, and so, but again, there may be others in your regions, in the western and central states. And so here is one of the longhorn bees, which are mainly known for being aster specialists. So it's likely collecting nectar on the verbena. And if you grow verbena, you know how important they are for lots of other butterflies and bees besides their specialists. And then finally, I think this is the last one, the violet family. Andrena, oh no, I guess there is one more. Andrena violae was the only specialist, but of course we, that was the last one. I just wanted to mention that of course we have some butterflies that are dependent on violets, and in my region, the Diana fritillary is actually a rare butterfly now, and so growing violets could be very important for supporting those butterflies. All right, so how can you help in other ways? I've already talked about a few, but I wanted to just go into a little more detail. And so I really encourage you to explore iNaturalist. I had tried using it at one point, and I had a funny experience, and I didn't use it, but then I had to give a program for Mount Rogers, and I started to use it because for last year, since due to COVID, they had a virtual rally, and I learned that even just starting to take photographs, within 1 week I had improved quite a bit, and discovered all the really neat things you can learn by using iNaturalist. But you're also contributing to a data set that will really help us understand a lot of different species better and improve conservation planning in the future and right now. So this is something I pulled up, the Ohio Bee Atlas, so you can see if you go on iNaturalist, you can join a specific group if you like. A lot of times, even if you're not part of that group, they have agreements with iNaturalist to be able to collect the data. Any data that's related to bees in Ohio is added to the Ohio Bee Atlas automatically. And if you find a rare species, then there's a feature where you can obscure the specific location, but the record is still there. And you might be contacted by a natural heritage staff to help them go look for that rare species. So the Ohio Bee Atlas also has some really great tips for documentation. If you do want to put something and hope to have it ID'd on iNaturalist or Bug Guide, then it's important to try to get some good close-up shots. And you can get these little macro clip-on lenses that do a terrific job. And even with without the clip-on, a lot of our iPhones are great. And the Seek app is only available as a phone app. The iNaturalist you can use on your computer, and it has a bunch more features. You can bulk upload things, but the Seek app was really designed to engage young people. And you'll notice that you can join a challenge, or you can get a badge depending on how many species you identify. And so if you want to get your kids or grandkids or brother or sister excited about going outside, there are some ways to develop a competitive interest in exploring. And then Bug Guide's another wonderful site. The neat thing about Bug Guide is there are volunteers that are experts that if you upload a photograph and tag it for identification, then eventually someone will identify it to as close as they can to species. And then Discover Life we kind of highlighted before, but there's lots of great information on there, and they're expanding more to the west. And then we have some new information from Xerces now about buying bee-safe plants that don't have toxic chemicals on them. And just recently these new buying bee-safe plant guides were developed, and also for nurseries growing and selling, offering bee-safe plants. I wanted to just mention that besides host plants, consider nesting needs, especially for some of our cavity nesting bees. And also, besides wildflowers, think trees. And here in the Southeast, especially in urban areas, planting trees for shade can be really, really important. But a lot of our tree species have wonderful flowering resources or other host properties. And then these are some bee resources. I really encourage you, if you're interested in bees at all, Xerces has a bunch of information online for free. But Olivia Carroll and Joe Wilson's book is just extraordinary, and I really encourage you to pick that up. And this is my favorite guide, that's most relevant to my region. And I really love this chart that shows the nesting habits based on family. And then Heather Holmes' books are really fantastic. And she's based in Minnesota, but a lot of the plants that she documents are found all over the country. And I think it would be helpful for anyone around the country, not just in the Midwest, northern. And then I wanted to point out that more and more states have native and wild bee extension and monitoring programs. And so if you're interested in native bees, check with your extension to see if there are new professors that are starting to do this kind of work. And Ohio State's a great example. They were interested in Denise working with honeybees, and she said, well, I really want to also work with native bees. And so she really developed an excellent program. And in Oregon, they have a tremendous bee atlas program that depends on volunteers. And they have a wonderful podcast called Pollination. And here in North Carolina, Elsa Youngstedt and her grad student Hannah developed this beautiful Bees of North Carolina. And almost every state now has something along these lines. Again, I want to thank the Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA volunteers for sharing your knowledge and love of the little things that run the world. And I want to thank Xerces Society supporters. We're a not-for-profit and we're donor supported. And I want to thank the Xerces team for being so wonderful. I am heading on a new adventure to Morocco shortly, and I will miss everybody greatly. Okay, so that's it. I hope that y'all got something good out of that, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. We do have some good questions. A lot of people are saying thank you so much. They really liked the presentation. Let's see. So one person is wondering, do we use the term host plant for the plants that specialist bees get their pollen from? just as we do for caterpillars, or is there a different term?
That's the term that I'm familiar with. Yeah, host plant is what I say. I think that's the correct term.
Okay. Another person is wondering, this is kind of a common question, are there available resources or files outlining specialists? Oh, someone just put in the chat and it went up. Specialists associated with native plants by region. So are there resources out there that people can use to look at their region and find those associations?
Oh gosh, so I guess maybe I went over that first slide a little too quickly. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, it might be worth just reviewing that quickly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So Fowler and Droege created the Eastern website, and let me. I'm not sure how to jump quickly, so we'll have to just go through. But since 2019, Fowler has created websites for both the central U.S. and the western U.S. So yeah, sorry I went over that so quickly that wasn't clear. But so let's see. So here you go. So if you go to any one of the sites, so here in this case, this is the pollen specialist bees of the eastern United States. If you scroll down a little bit, then here's the pollen specialist bees of the western United States. And then if you click the next link, it takes you to the central United States. And so the same thing, if you opened up the pollen specialist bees of central United States, there's links to the other two lists. The only difference right now is that the host plant page, which is this one, is only available for the East. But I wouldn't be surprised if that changes. So, yeah. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks for reviewing that. And for those who asked, we've recorded this webinar and it will be available on the Xerces YouTube channel. So you'll be able to go back and look at all these great resources and links. Another question that I think is great is someone's wondering, where do native bees sleep at night?
Oh, well, the female bees generally would sleep in their nests, and then the male bees don't have nests. So sometimes you'll see aggregations of male bees on plants, but it's hard to see them. And then, as I mentioned, the squash bees, the males will sleep in the squash flowers. And I don't know that much. I presume they just shelter where they hope that birds or other predators won't find them.
Great. I think that answers that question. And it's always fun to go out and try to find bees sleeping on cold mornings out there. Yes. Another question someone had is, are there specialist bees for clover? Oh,
well, there are specialist bees for, I should have included the Namia melandera. So out in the western U.S. and in Canada, there's a specialist bee on alfalfa. I'm not sure about clover per se, but you could pull up the Fowler list, and the trifolium clovers are not native; those are introduced. So there may be specialists in the countries where they're from. Maybe I can't remember if there are any native trifolium species or not. But yeah, so I don't know specifically, but hopefully you could look on one of these lists where in your region to see. Or if you can't find that out, you're welcome to write to me, and I'll try to answer that question.
Great. One other question about kind of a specific plant. Someone was wondering, so they see blueberry bees on their native blueberries, and they're wondering if those also pollinate cultivars of blueberries that are raised for commercial use.
Oh, yes. All of our cultivars of blueberries are derived from native species. So actually all of our cultivars are basically native plants. So yeah. We actually have a lot more specialists on blueberries than I'm not sure if I highlighted some of the other ones, but Jim Kane did a lot of work on other bees that might pollinate blueberries.
Great. All right, it looks like we're just about out of time. So if we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry, and you could reach out to Nancy. It looks like she has her email addresses listed on this slide if you have other questions. And once again, thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us, and to our captioner who is here today, and for all of you for coming and learning about specialist bees. And again, this presentation will be on the Xerces YouTube channel, so you'll be able to go back and see all the great resources that Nancy shared. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.